I rise to support Budget 2023, tabled by my honorable friend, the Senior Minister in the Office of the President with responsibility for finance. Mr. Speaker, like our previous budgets, Budget 2023 continues to make provision for the development of our country in line with the fundamental philosophy of the People's Progressive Party Civic, which is to secure broad-based, inclusive development for all Guyanese. Mr. Speaker, successive PPPC governments have always focused on and paid attention to what we believe are some fundamental development imperatives. These include ensuring that our citizens have access to education and that they have access to health care and to safe drinking water, to name a few. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that our people ought to have affordable access to basic food items, such as would ensure a balanced and healthy nutrition. And we believe, Mr. Speaker, that every citizen has a right to shelter and to own a home. We have also focused on ensuring that our people are able to earn a living and secure their livelihoods through dignified work. And additionally, Mr. Speaker, we have paid special attention to the development of agriculture because we are committed to food security for Guyana and all Guyanese. Mr. Speaker, these are a few of the fundamental developmental objectives to which the PPP Civic has always been committed. And these are the reasons why I make mention of them now. The first reason that I mention these fundamental objectives of ours, Mr. Speaker, is that these objectives are as indispensable to the well-being of individual citizens as they are for our collective development. Mr. Speaker, we consider things like education, healthcare, food supply, and safe drinking water to be almost akin to fundamental rights. That is why, sir, we are committed to providing certain services free or almost free to those who would otherwise be unable to afford them. And it is why, Mr. Speaker, we have never wavered in our commitment to providing free education for nursery, primary, and secondary students. Mr. Speaker, it is why we continue to maintain a free public health care delivery system. And, Mr. Speaker, it's also why we provide a substantial subsidy to old age pensioners for access to potable water. Mr. Speaker, another reason that I'm drawing attention to these fundamental features of our philosophy is that as simple and basic as these things are, they cannot be taken for granted. We cannot take them for granted, Mr. Speaker, because it is evident that our colleagues on the opposition benches neither understand nor believe in the importance of these things for development. Mr. Speaker, when the opposition say, and I do say for the purposes of this presentation, Mr. Speaker, that when I say opposition, I do exclude the honorable member, Mr. Schuman, for the purposes of this argument. When the opposition says to the people that there is nothing for them in the budget that provides over $250 billion for investment in and delivery of healthcare, education, housing, and portable water for hundreds of thousands of Guyanese, this is simply a reflection of the fact that the opposition places no value on these things. But for those of us who do value these things, Mr. Speaker, it is incomprehensible that anyone can say that there is nothing in the budget for ordinary people when we have almost $85 billion allocated for education. This includes the provision of free education at nursery, primary, and secondary levels to almost 200,000 school-aged children. But the opposition sees no value in this. We have substantial subsidies for tertiary education at the University of Guyana, at the universities overseas, and under the GOAL program, which has benefited almost 14,000 young people since its commencement in 2021. Yet they see no value in this. They say the budget has nothing for ordinary people. Mr. Speaker, in 2021, we extended the Because We Care cash grant to all students which brought the number of beneficiaries to close to 215,000 school-age children. But they see no value in any of this. Our critics continue to maintain that there is nothing in the budget for ordinary people. Mr. Speaker, how can anyone claim it's not a budget for poor people when we have $95 billion for health, $95 billion for a system that provides health care services to tens of thousands of people each year, a system that provides free of cost services such as doctors' consultations, laboratory tests, prescription drugs, maternal health care, and direct subsidies for dialysis treatment, among other benefits. Many of our people could not afford comparable services in the private healthcare system, yet the opposition sees no value in this. Mr. Speaker, the political opposition sees no value in the provisions for 6 regional hospitals and the pediatric and maternal hospital. They don't conceive that these 7 hospitals will provide hundreds of jobs to Guyanese during their construction, thousands of high-quality healthcare jobs during their operation, and serve tens of thousands of our citizens far into the future. No, Mr. Speaker. All they see is a contractor obtaining a multi-million-dollar contract, and beyond that, they see no value in this measure. Mr. Speaker, we have an allocation of $72 billion for the housing and water sectors. This is reflective of our philosophy that every Guyanese should be able to afford a home and that all should have access to potable water, either at home or where this is not economically feasible, within a reasonable distance from it. Mr. Speaker, opposition sees no value in this. All told, Mr. Speaker, when we look at these sectors in which the state provides these social services to the majority of our population, the total allocation in our budget is over $250 billion. That is almost 1/3 of the budget dedicated to securing what we believe are fundamental elements of a civilized society: health, education, housing, and access to potable water. And I have not yet touched on our measures that deal with the other fundamental elements of our philosophy, which is food security. Despite all of this, Mr. Speaker, the opposition says to the people, there is nothing in this budget for you. Mr. Speaker, the opposition describes $250 billion in essential social spending as nothing. But we understand that this is because they truly don't see these things as important. Mr. Speaker, if the opposition believed in the importance of education, they would not have taken away the uniform grants and the school grants, and they would not have hiked the fees for the UG students by 35% when they were in government. Had the opposition believed in the importance of universal access to safe drinking water, they would not have taken away that subsidy that the PPPC government had instituted for pensioners. Mr. Speaker, if the opposition believed, as we do, that every person should be able to own their own home, they would not have disbanded the Ministry of Housing. They would have made all efforts to ensure that the housing programs begun by the PPP Civic were continued. And they would never encourage anyone who placed their trust and confidence in them to reject a guarantee of freehold property in favor of trying to demand unrealistic levels of compensation for land to which they have no remotely viable claim to legal title. Mr. Speaker, if the opposition believed, as we do, that people should be able to earn a living through dignified work, then they would not have callously dismissed over 7,000 sugar workers and over 2,000 community service officers, nor would they mock the part-time work. No party which truly cares for people would ever simply retrench almost 10,000 people and walk away without a backward glance. And to add insult to injury, Mr. Speaker, the retrenched sugar workers were forced to move to the courts to receive the severance that was legally due to them. There is a signal lesson here, Mr. Speaker. That lesson is that values matter. I am at idem with Honorable Member Walton Desir on this. The Honorable Member says that if you look at the budget, you will see what we value. Well, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the budget, you will see that almost 1/3 of all spending is dedicated to providing social services, which directly impact hundreds of thousands of Guyanese every day, in every county, in every region, in every town, in every village, and in every community in the country. That, Mr. Speaker, is the real reflection of our values. And if you examine budgets of the PPP civic governments over the decades, you will see those values consistently reflected in them. But still, Mr. Speaker, the opposition says there is nothing in the budget for ordinary people. And we must treat with that. So, Mr. Speaker, let us imagine for a moment that what the opposition says were true, as far-fetched as it is. What would Guyana look like if we had nothing in the budget for health? What would it look like if we had nothing for education, nothing for housing, nothing for water, nothing for social security, and so on? What would Guyana look like? It turns out that we don't have to go far, Mr. Speaker, to see what it looks like when a government sees no value in looking after the fundamental needs of the people. Mr. Speaker, we lived through that right here in Guyana in the 1970s, the 1980s under the PNC. And we were headed right back there in the period 2015 to 2020 when the PNC-led APNU-AFC coalition was in office. Mr. Speaker, I know that they don't want us to speak about these things, but we have to speak of these things, Mr. Speaker. We speak of them because we have to understand the thinking, the values, the culture, the DNA of our friends on the other side. We have to look to their past, Mr. Speaker, in order to understand them in the present. Mr. Speaker, in the 70s and 80s under the government of the PNC, if you visited a public hospital, you would be lucky if you could even get Panadol to ease your pain. During that time, the economic conditions in our country were so dire that our teachers were emigrating in droves to the Caribbean and to Africa and other corners of the world. During that time, Mr. Speaker, you could barely find anything other than rice, sugar, and salt on the shelves of the supermarket. People had to line up for hours and hours to obtain basic food items. During that time, Mr. Speaker, thousands of our citizens could not even dream of affording their own home. They were forced to squat in conditions that were poorly drained, bushy swamplands, without roads, electricity, portable water, or communications. Mr. Speaker, the rural poor, primarily the women and girls amongst them, walked long distances to collect water for cooking and other household purposes. And at that time, Mr. Speaker, industry and our agriculture were decimated. We could barely feed ourselves. Our people were impoverished. We were the sick child of the Caribbean, pariahs in the region. Mr. Speaker, lest the honorable colleagues on the other side of this House be inclined to dispute my characterization of those years under their tenure, permit me, sir, to quote at some length from a paper published in a Journal of African Studies out of the University of California, Los Angeles in 1982. The author of the paper was Professor Clive Thomas and is entitled "The Current Crisis in Guyana." Professor Thomas opens up by saying, and I open quote, "In Guyana at the moment, there is a fundamental crisis which involves every major dimension of national life." I close quote. He goes on to say, I open quote, "At the heart of the crisis is a shocking reality that there has been virtual destruction and consequent collapse of the production system in the country." Close quote. The professor then outlined the disastrous declines in sugar, bauxite, and alumina between 1970 and 1990 and concluded, and I open quote, "The PNC takeover of the economy has therefore been accompanied by rapid destruction." Close quote. Bear with me, please, Mr. Speaker, because as we say, During the 2015 to 2020, history repeated itself. He further quotes, and I open quote, "The system of public utilities has virtually collapsed. Electricity, water supply, public transport, telephone services have all deteriorated to levels unheard of before." He said, "Less than 10% of health personnel is engaged in preventative medicine, and almost all the health facilities are confined to urban areas," close quote. So when the honorable member says that it's ludicrous to put the Hospitality Institute in Port Morant, it is a reflection of their philosophy that facilities should be confined to urban areas, that no investment ought to be made in rural communities. We need to look past that to understand them and their thinking, Mr. Speaker. Professor Thomas continues to say, in housing, the targeted production for the period 1972 to 1976 was 65,000 housing units. And of these, only 6,000 houses were built. Since then, with the collapse of the economy, housing construction is at a virtual standstill. Mr. Speaker, when we wonder why it is that they shut down the housing ministry and decimated the housing programs, we must understand that this is reflective of their philosophy, which places no priority on housing. Finally, Mr. Speaker, Professor Thomas says in that paper that the result of PNC's mismanagement, and I begin quote, has been an estimated decline in the real per capita income of the order of 44% between 1976 and 1980. This declining economy has been accompanied by increasing unemployment, now estimated at over 40% of the labor force, widespread inflation, currently at double-digit rates, and shortages of everything from food to spare parts, close quote. There we have it, Mr. Speaker. Not in my words, but in the words of one who not so long ago was a part of the APNU-AFC administration. Mr. Speaker, that is what Guyana looked like when the budget had in it nothing for the people. I know that some of our colleagues on the other side would want to be quick to quote Professor Thomas on some of his criticism that he has leveled against PPPC governments. All I would say to them, Mr. Speaker, is that this article, which I quote, comes from a peer-reviewed academic journal published by a world-renowned university. Without intending to disrespect Mr. Thomas, Mr. Speaker, I rather suspect that the publications the oppositions may rely on would lack this requirement for rigorous academic scrutiny. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues on the other side don't want to hear us speak of these things. I know they will want to say that all this is ancient history. But Mr. Speaker, as we saw in the period 2015 to 2020, history repeated itself with the same economic mismanagement and electoral malpractice that we have seen in the 1980s. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, today, the situation could not be more starkly different. Today, sir, tens of thousands of our citizens own their own homes, having benefited from the housing programs of various PPPC administrations. Today, in hundreds of communities across the length and breadth of Guyana, our people have access to safe drinking water. Mr. Speaker, today, our people have ready and affordable access to prescription drugs, including those to treat chronic illnesses like diabetes and hypertension, and we have instituted an unconditional grant for dialysis treatment for anyone who requires it. Today, we are investing in significant sums in upgrading healthcare facilities across the length and breadth of the country, and not just in the urban areas. Mr. Speaker, our primary and secondary school performances have been steadily improving as we continue to invest in construction and upgrading of school infrastructure, as we've heard from my honorable colleague, Minister Manichan, and as we work on upskilling teachers, as well as improving their salaries and working conditions. Today, Mr. Speaker, we are no longer the sick child of the region. Our leadership in CARICOM is acknowledged. Our Caribbean brothers and sisters are once again making their way to our shores in search of prosperity as they did in the pre-independence era. And today, Mr. Speaker, Guyanese can travel to the United Kingdom without a visa because our people are no longer presumed to be economic migrants, since we have rebuilt our economy and restored Guyana in the eyes of the international community. We have made all of these gains, Mr. Speaker, because of that fundamental people-centered development philosophy of which I spoke. And Budget 2023 is based on that same philosophy that delivered those gains between 1992 to 2015 and from 2020 to present day. But the opposition must oppose, Mr. Speaker, and we take no real issue with that. Ideally, we would wish for rational and constructive criticism, but we have what we have. So we must treat with the contributions of the opposition such as they are. Mr. Speaker, part of the reason for this recurring claim that there is nothing in the budget for ordinary people is that the opposition looks at each budget in isolation, as though every year the country resets and starts from scratch again. But each budget is merely the current year's provision within a multi-year program. That is why you will see the budget framed in the context of a medium-term expenditure framework. Bearing this medium-term framework in mind, Mr. Speaker, I will treat with some of the criticism leveled by the opposition. Most of the members on the other side have spoken about inflation. They say that we have nothing in the budget to combat inflation. Mr. Speaker, I am no economist, but even the little economics that I know tells me that if one is looking to fiscal policy to combat inflation, your options are essentially to increase taxes or reduce spending, or both. When it comes to inflation, Mr. Speaker, we're not trying to raise taxes like the coalition did or reduce social spending as they did. We are committing to spending that improves lives today and builds prosperity for tomorrow. So our challenge is to manage that spending in a way that ensures that inflation is restricted to a manageable level. To put it simply, Mr. Speaker, we have to grow at a pace which we can sustain. Mr. Speaker, the largest contributor to inflation is the price of fuel and petroleum products, among the latter fertilizers, critical, of course, to our agricultural industries. Mr. Speaker, we have removed excise tax on fuel completely in 2022, and this measure has been preserved in 2023. Preserving this measure is a deliberate policy choice. So how can the opposition rationally contend that we have made no provision that provides relief for increases in costs of living? Mr. Speaker, in 2022, we also provided a massive fertilizer subsidy, $1 billion to farmers. Taken together, these two measures, excise tax remission and fertilizer subsidies, would have contained price increases in production, transportation, and distribution for fresh fruits, vegetables, and livestock. These measures also allowed for cash crop farming to rebound after the disastrous floods of last year, and we contend, Mr. Speaker, that were it not for these policies, food prices would have been far higher than they are now. So how can anyone rationally contend that we have done nothing to deal with costs of living? In 2020, Mr. Speaker, we removed VAT on data and electricity. In subsequent years, we reduced excise tax on concrete and other construction materials. We removed 200 or so taxes that were instituted by the coalition government. We have made a deliberate policy choice to preserve these measures in Budget 2023, and all of these have served to cushion the impact on the man and woman on the street. So how really can it be said that there's nothing to deal with cost of living increases? Mr. Speaker, the Inter-American Development Bank, in its Caribbean Economic Quarterly Report for December 2022, recognized all of these measures as policy responses aimed at easing the impact of increases on the population. The IDB recognizes them, Mr. Speaker, but the opposition tells the people that they don't exist. For good measure, Mr. Speaker, I also draw your attention to that IDB report that also acknowledges that inflation we face is primarily induced by global events, including the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Mr. Speaker, recall in 2021 that even though inflation was measured at 5.7%, we instituted a public sector salary increase of 7% across the board. Public servants were therefore not only therefore preserve their real wages, but increase them as a result. In 2022, in the face of an inflation rate of 7.2%, the minimum increase for public servants was 8% across the board, with further increases for our hard-working nurses, policemen, soldiers, and other members of the disciplined services. So these claims that we have no provisions to cushion the effect of rising prices cannot stand up to serious scrutiny. It's not a serious conversation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to listen to some of our colleagues, senior members of the Alliance for Change, speaking on a television program on January 14th, the Alliance on the Move. In that program, the honorable members called for 100% subsidy for the Berbice Bridge, the Demerara Harbor Bridge, and for all the ferries and bridge crossing. They called for 100% subsidy of university fees, cancellation of all student debt, almost doubling of the minimum wage at one stroke, and to top it all off, they called for a reduction in VAT. To sum it up, Mr. Speaker, they basically call for insubstantial increases in expenditure together with reductions in tax revenues. To pay for all these additional subsidies, for all this additional spending, their attitude was basically, we have all money, so let's spend it. Mr. Speaker, it is this same kind of attitude that led this country to rack and ruin in the 1970s and 1980s. I am not saying this to insult the honorable members, Mr. Speaker. I'm saying this to put the Guyanese people on notice that this is what awaits us if we let the AP and UAFC get their hands on the levers of government again with this type of thinking. What would they have us do, Mr. Speaker, when as surely as night follows day, oil prices drop from the current geopolitically induced high? Just this morning, sir, in speaking to a group of potential foreign investors, my honorable colleague, Dr. Sin, made the point that in the recent past, we have seen oil prices as high as $140 per barrel, and we've seen them as low as $20 and even lower per barrel. When we no longer have oil revenues, apply subsidies. Will they have us remove all those subsidies and expose the Guyanese people to massive sticker shock like they did in the 1970s? Or having increased the wage bill to unsustainable levels, would they have us implement the massive retrenchment we saw in the 1980s when public servants were severed in the thousands? Or like in the 2020 period when they retrenched the sugar workers and the CSOs? Mr. Speaker, after they rack up the expenditure to unsustainable levels, we can look to history again to see what they will do when the oil prices drop. Mr. Speaker, permit me to quote Professor Thomas again from the same paper. Faced with a self-induced economic crisis, the professor said, the main focus of the government policy has been to seek to reduce workers' living standards in order to reduce consumption. I continue to quote, to achieve this, the government's assault on the worker standard of living began in 1976. The main mechanisms they used were the removal of all government subsidies, increased taxation, retrenchment of workers, a freeze in all wages, cuts in social spending. Does this sound familiar, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, many of us know what usually happens when a country has to look to the IMF for assistance. They usually come, the IMF, with a standard laundry list of onerous measures that impose severe hardships on population. But Professor Thomas wrote that the PNC programs were so severe and so brutal that the IMF did not have to impose any additional austerity measures other than restricted government borrowing. He asserted that, and I begin quote, the anti-working class character of the government's policy was already formed before its approach to the IMF, close quote. So, Mr. Speaker, from the interventions that we are seeing from the opposite side of this honorable house, we can see that if the opposition had their way, what they would do would be for us to return to the reckless policies of the 70s and the 80s. They would lick out the oil money in the good years, like they squandered the sugar levy, and when the prices drop, true to their anti-working class credentials, it is the poor amongst us who would have to shoulder the brunt of the burden to take us to economic recovery. I know that they don't want to hear these things, Mr. Speaker. They don't want us to expose their history. But, Mr. Speaker, as I said, history repeated itself. Look what happened in 2020, Mr. Speaker. In 2020, almost 30 years after we thought we had closed the...
Honorable Minister, in order to continue, you need a 5-minute extension.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask that my colleague is given a minimum of 5 minutes to conclude. I would like it to have much more time, of course.
Yeah.
Honorable Minister.
Yeah. Look what happened in 2020. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2020, almost 30 years after we thought we had closed the door on a particular sordid chapter of our history, almost 30 years after we thought we had left the nightmare of electoral malpractice behind, came the worst attempt at election rigging. That disgrace, Mr. Speaker, led the OAS observer mission here to declare that he had, and I begin quote, never seen a more transparent attempt to alter the results of the election, end quote. They don't want to hear it, Mr. Speaker, but I'm raising these things because I want to say to all Guyanese who believe that the economic bungling and the electoral malpractice of the 1970s and 80s are firmly in our past, that they would be sadly mistaken. The period 2015 to 2020 shows clearly that the leopard has not changed its stripes. Mr. Speaker, if we dare to think that even for a minute that the danger is behind us, we have powerful proof to the contrary given to us literally today. That proof, Mr. Speaker, lies in the fiction that they continue to promote about the 2020 election. Mr. Speaker, every time that they refer to us as the installed government, as several of the speakers did yesterday and again today, what they are saying about the election is that we lost, they won, and that the real result of the election is in the numbers on the bed sheet, on the spreadsheet, which they can prove from the statements of poll, which a former president has never seen, but which a current leader of the opposition has safely in the position waited to produce when the time is right to do so. And we can safely say that these things are, we can't safely say that these things are in our past because they have passed on the doctrine to the generations of their party. Some of the most ardent defenders of that big fiction, Mr. Speaker, were the young ones, the future of the opposition. They were the ones who were here at the recount, doubling down on the big fiction every day. The Honorable Member Hughes, the Honorable Member Patterson, the Honorable Members Jones and Duncan, the Honorable Member Manny Paul, who I understand is the youngest member of this Honorable House. Mr. Speaker, the culture and the values have been handed down to the next generation on that side of the House. So we know what we can expect when the APNU AFC is to be returned to office, even with that generation in leadership. Mr. Speaker, when we speak of development, we usually implicitly mean social and economic development. I've spent a lot of time on our measures for social development because it is important to us to remind the Guyanese people that even as we pursue transformative economic development, that we remain true to our commitment and our core as a people-centered social development, something which the opposition would have them believe is non-existent. I wish, therefore, to turn to some aspects of our economic development as regard tourism industry and commerce. Mr. Speaker, CPL will return to Guyana in 2023, and it will again in 2024. In 2022, almost immediately as we announced the dates for Cricket Carnival, hotels were fully booked for that period. In addition to hotel bookings, we had almost 250 potential bed and breakfast facilities that were inspected and conditionally approved to provide service to visitors. Mr. Speaker, Cricket Carnival had tremendous economic impact on a range of Guyanese, including transportation service providers, bed and breakfast owners, small vendors, artists, and performers, in addition to hospital and restaurant operators. It drove record levels of visitor arrivals in September 2022. Our visitor arrival rates for 2022 exceeded 291,000, a 94% increase over 2021. This performance exceeds even the global recovery rate of 65% and the regional average of 81%. We aim to build on this success of Cricket Carnival, Mr. Speaker, and as I said a little earlier, the event will return this year and next year, in keeping with our plans to attract major events and conferences to Guyana with their spillover effects on our service economy. I would note, Mr. Speaker, that a strategy like this would have no prospect of success if our country had not been returned from a pariah status, that it certainly would have been if the case, in the case if we had not foiled the attempts to roll back our democracy in 2020. Mr. Speaker, we continue with our quest to open up new air routes to destination Guyana. You may recall that in 2021, we added a new carrier in the Caribbean, provided access through Barbados to several Caribbean countries and beyond. In 2022, another airline, Fly Always, commenced operating a Guyana to Cuba route. In a few weeks, we will witness the inaugural flight of British Airways, which will commence flights from early 2023, providing a virtually direct route to London. These developments will increase the viability of our business and leisure tourism market. In the area of small business, I am wrapping up, Mr. Speaker, we have disbursed well over 2,000 grants directly to small, medium, and micro enterprises in the 2 years coming into office. Over 2,000 grants, Mr. Speaker. Last year, we disbursed 1,430 grants to these enterprises through the Small Business Development Fund. Mr. Speaker, in the past 5 years of the coalition government, they distributed a mere 560 grants. Mr. Speaker, these grants go mainly to small operators, the man and the woman in the street, looking to run a business, and to young people. By this, I mean to say those very people that the opposition claims to care for and say that we do nothing for. We have distributed over 2,000 grants in under 3 years, Mr. Speaker, while they distributed 560 grants in just over 5 years. In my inaugural presentation to this House, I pledged the administration's commitment to operationalize the Belvedere Business Incubator within our first term in office. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that I drew attention to the fact that the coalition held a purported launch of this facility just prior to the 2020 election gimmick clearly. Mr. Speaker, might I remind the House that the facility that they launched was in fact an empty building, no equipment, no furniture, no staff, not even any electricity. Today, Mr. Speaker, I wish to place on record that October 11, the Belvedere Business Incubator had its relaunch. I'm pleased to report that the center is operational and the businesses within Region 6 have begun to benefit from this investment. There are more than 2,000 pounds of agro-processed products, including a range of indigenous flowers, were already produced at the incubator.
Honorable Minister, I do recall some sentences ago, I think it was 2 minutes ago.
I will wrap up, please, Mr.
Honorable Minister, some 2 minutes ago you said you are wrapping up. I think your time is expired. I'll give you 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, these are just some of the initiatives in Budget 2023 by which we shall be improving lives today and building prosperity for tomorrow. I unreservedly support the measures contained in this budget, and I urge all of the members of the Honorable House to support likewise. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. I now call on the Honorable Tabitha Sarabo Haley to make her presentation.
Good afternoon, all. Mr. Speaker. Oh, I should also say Happy New Year, since I've been here. Mr. Speaker, as I stand here to give my response to Budget 2023, it would be remiss of me not to start off